I have been growing vegetables here in the Midlands of Ireland for quite a while, and I've generally assumed that some types of vegetable crops just won't grow very well here. Sweet potato is one of them, as I've always seen it as a heat-loving crop that just won't produce enough in the cool conditions that we have here to be worth growing. We do grow a lot of different types of heat-loving crops in the polytunnels, but these are usually high-value fruiting crops such as tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. And because sweet potatoes are more of a storage root crop, I wasn't sure if it was worth taking up space in the polytunnels to try to grow these large plants. But this past year, I decided to grow quite a few sweet potato plants in one of the polytunnels, and it was great to be able to harvest a crop like this. I still think this is probably more of a novelty crop, one that I only ever give a little bit of space for growing in, unless I can find ways to get a much bigger crop out of these plants. Sweet potato plants are unlike any other vegetable crop that I've grown before, with long trailing vines and the harvestable part buried right underneath the stem. I had to do some research to find out basic details about propagation care and harvesting, but it was hard to find specific advice about growing them in a cool climate like this. Sweet potato plants are typically grown from slips, which are the shoots that sprout from the stored sweet potato itself. This is a really interesting form of vegetative propagation, which is something that I generally only do with garlic and potatoes, as most other vegetable crops are typically grown from seed. The closest that I've come to the slips of a sweet potato is pinching off the side shoots of a tomato plant and rooting it into a pot in order to produce a second plant. Because this is not a common crop in Ireland, it was really hard to find a place to buy slips, and my main supplier had sold out. So I ended up buying sweet potatoes from two different grocery stores, and I have no idea where they were originally grown or if these varieties were even appropriate for growing in this climate. And in the third week of March, I followed general advice for encouraging these sweet potatoes to sprout and grow slips, which I could pull off and transplant into the soil. This involved partially burying the sweet potatoes in a tray of growing medium and keeping them warm and moist enough to encourage the slips to develop. By the first week of May, I figured that the soil in the polytunnel had warmed up enough for transplanting the sweet potato slips, but I was concerned that I may have left some of them grow too long. I carefully broke off the individual slips, some of which already had roots developing, which is something that I want to encourage more of the next time I grow them. And other slips didn't have any obvious roots developing yet, and I was hoping that simply burying the end in the moist soil would be enough to let these plants grow. I transplanted all of the slips down the center of the bed, spaced about 40 centimeters apart, and I ended up with 32 plants in about 10 square meters of growing space. There would be a bit of extra space in the paths for the vines to grow into, but the plastic at the side of the polytunnel would keep the vines well contained on the other side. I covered the young transplants with horticultural fleece for the first few weeks, and then I just let them grow with occasional watering, and it seems that all of the slips developed into plants. 2 months after transplanting, these plants were growing really well, but it wasn't until almost August, when most of the warmth of the summer had already finished, that the vines of these plants had finally filled out the full bed. Carefully pulling away some of the soil at the base of the stem, I could see that some of the roots were already starting to swell, and it was great to know that we were actually going to get a crop. We had added a fair amount of compost and concentrated fertility to this bed at the beginning of this season, and we liquid fed the entire polytunnel through the drip lines a few times, so I figured that there was probably enough fertility for these plants. I had cut back and repositioned the vines of these plants a few times in order to try to contain them within the bed, but I know that they probably would have benefited from a lot more space. They probably also would have benefited from more sunlight, as they were overshadowed by a tall crop of tomatoes on one side, so they only really had full sun for the morning. I wasn't sure when to harvest these plants, and I pulled out one plant of each variety in early September from either end of the bed. With one of these plants, I carefully separated out all of the vines and then dug up the cluster of roots, and then spread the whole plant out on the ground, or at least what I was able to pull out. It was really cool to see the growth habit of this vining plant, with quite a few side shoots growing about 1.5 meters away from the single stem at the base of the plant. Below ground, quite a few of the main roots had swollen with the storage of carbohydrates and nutrients, and apparently these are true roots, unlike the tubers that develop on standard potato plants. I was pleasantly surprised that some of these roots had already grown quite large, but others were still quite thin or only just starting to swell. I assumed that with enough sunlight, warmth, space, nutrients, water, and time to grow, most of these roots would have grown into decent-sized sweet potatoes for harvesting. The other variety that I pulled out was considerably larger, with more roots forming, and weighed about twice as much as the other plant. I had learned that it is important to try to cure these roots after harvesting, leaving them in a warm and moist spot for about a week and then transferring them into a cooler and drier place for even longer, so that more of the carbohydrates or starches within the roots have a chance to transform into sugars. A few weeks later, we were able to eat locally grown sweet potatoes, which was a really cool thing to be able to do, but they weren't as sweet as I would have expected. I wasn't sure when it would be best to harvest the rest of the crop, and I wanted to give enough time for the roots to be able to grow as big as possible. But I'd also heard that cooler soil temperatures can cause the sweet potato roots to decline in quality, unlike so many other storage root crops that seem to improve in quality with the lower temperatures of the autumn. With everything else going on, it ended up being November before I dug out the rest of the crop. And although we hadn't had a hard frost in the polytunnel yet, the leaves and vines of these plants had started to die back. I cut all of the vines off just above the soil surface, and they were easier to remove as one big tangled mass. I carefully loosened the soil around each cluster of roots and tried to ease them out of the soil without damaging them or causing some of the longer, thinner roots to snap off. After the main clump of roots had been removed, I dug around the soil with my hand to find any roots that might have remained. With one of the varieties, some of the roots seemed to be deeper in the soil, and with the other variety seeming to be more clumped together, which made it easier to harvest. Some of the plants had been able to produce a much larger cluster of roots, probably because they had been able to grow much larger vines. And others were quite small, or with many of their roots still quite thin, and I assume this was because of competition from their more aggressive or established neighbors. I wonder how this related to the difference in size of the slips that were originally used, or the extent of the root system that had developed by the time they were transplanted. I suspect that wider spacing between the plants would have helped produce a greater number of larger roots, which would have been more useful in the kitchen. I had thought that soil compaction might have been an issue, but some of the plants were able to produce a big mass of roots that would have pushed aside a lot of soil. This was a nice crop to be able to harvest, especially as I hadn't expected much to be produced, and it's great to have a bunch of homegrown sweet potatoes in storage for the winter. Weighing all the roots, we ended up with less than 1 kilogram per plant on average, with not much difference between the two varieties, but with considerable difference between individual plants. This translates to only 2.8 kilograms per square meter, which is not a great yield, especially for the amount of time that these plants were growing in the polytunnel. For comparison, I was able to harvest more than 5 kilograms per square meter from the higher value sweet pepper plants that were growing in the other side bed of the same polytunnel, and I consider this to be a fairly low yield. And crops like tomatoes can regularly produce more than 5 times the yield that the sweet potato plants had produced, in about the same amount of time in the soil. So, although the sweet potatoes were very easy to care for and are a nice crop to have, I will likely only grow a small amount of them. I wouldn't really see them as a staple crop in a polytunnel unless I had a lot more polytunnel space than I could make use of. But this is only my first attempt at growing this crop and probably not in ideal conditions. With a longer growing season, more direct sunlight, and perhaps a better variety, I think I could get this marginal crop to produce a lot more. I'm definitely going to grow sweet potatoes again next year, probably in the side bed of the older polytunnel, where they hopefully won't be as overshadowed. I need to remember to set aside some of the larger roots from this year's batch for producing slips for next year. And I plan to buy in slips of a better sweet potato variety from the main supplier that I use, which apparently has a shorter maturity date, which could really help in this climate. I also want to focus on growing better quality slips, ideally with larger root systems attached. And I want to start the plants earlier in the spring so that they have more time for growth during the warmer part of the growing season, which is generally June and July. But this will require extra protection with horticultural fleece for longer in the spring to protect from possible frosts and hopefully to boost the growth rate earlier in the season. I'm also going to try growing some of the plants in the large grow bags that I have, where the plants can be started in another location where they can be given more protection, and then moved into the final position in the polytunnel so that the deeper roots can grow out of the holes in the bottom of the bags into the soil below. I suspect that the black plastic and the raised bag will produce warmer growing conditions around the roots, which should help these plants. And the looser growing medium should make it easier for the roots to develop and easier to harvest. I have also seen others have success with growing sweet potatoes in conditioned straw bales, which would be an interesting thing to try, as I think that this crop needs all the help that it can get in this cool climate. But the real challenge would be to grow this heat-loving plant outside, if I can find a sheltered, sunny place with enough space for the spreading vines to grow into. It would be very interesting to see if I could get a reasonable crop out of a plant that I didn't think I would be able to grow. I really like that this Red Gardens project has developed enough that I have enough polytunnel space so that I can take risks on crops like this at a significant scale. And I want to thank all of those people who have financially supported this project over the years, as that support has helped pay for all of this. If you'd like to join them in supporting this Red Gardens project so that I can continue to do explorations like this for the coming years, please check out my Patreon and PayPal accounts in the video description, but only if you have the surplus resources. Of course, any kind of engagement with my videos helps to boost the channel, which helps the project, so thank you for watching.